3 days after giving birth to my twin daughters, I was still trying to adjust to the exhaustion, the sleepless nights, and the overwhelming responsibility that comes with knowing 2 tiny lives depend entirely on you, when the door to my hospital room opened and my mother-in-law walked in accompanied by a young woman I had never seen before, a woman who looked elegant, nervous, and strangely uncomfortable, while holding my husband's hand. At first I couldn't fully process what I was seeing. But then my mother-in-law placed a folder on my bed, removed several documents, slid a $22 million check across the blanket covering my daughters, and calmly informed me that I should take the money, sign the paperwork, surrender my parental rights, and disappear from their lives forever. What none of them realized was that they had just made the single biggest mistake of their lives, because a fortune can buy lawyers, executives, politicians, and silence, but it should never attempt to buy a woman whose entire career has been built around identifying hidden risks before they bring down empires. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 34 years old, and for more than a decade I worked as an actuary for some of the largest insurance companies in the country, a profession that most people find painfully boring because it revolves around numbers, probabilities, and financial scenarios that may not happen for years. But that was exactly why I loved it, because while most people make decisions based on emotions, instincts, or promises, I learned to trust patterns, inconsistencies, and small details that often go unnoticed until disaster arrives. My job was to identify cracks before buildings collapsed, to measure risks before companies failed, and to calculate the true cost of problems long before anyone else realized they existed. When I met Ethan, he seemed different from the wealthy people I had encountered throughout my career. He was charming, attentive, and appeared completely detached from the arrogance that often follows those who grow up surrounded by money. We married after 2 years together, and for a long time I genuinely believed we had built a stable life, a life with shared goals, mutual trust, and plans for a family. However, looking back now, I can see warning signs that I deliberately chose to ignore. Business trips that became increasingly frequent, phone calls that always ended when I entered the room, explanations that sounded unnecessarily complicated for simple questions, and a growing emotional distance that expanded so gradually I barely noticed it until it had become impossible to ignore. The true power inside the Whitmore family never belonged to Ethan, it belonged to his mother, Victoria Whitmore, a billionaire businesswoman whose public image had been carefully crafted to project sophistication, intelligence, and success. She appeared on magazine covers, chaired charitable foundations, and delivered speeches about leadership and financial discipline. To the outside world, she looked like the perfect self-made success story, but people who spent enough time around her quickly learned that she evaluated human relationships the same way she evaluated investments, constantly calculating value, usefulness, and replacement costs. She never insulted me directly and never treated me with open hostility. She was far too intelligent for that. Instead, she specialized in compliments that felt like criticism, smiles that carried hidden judgment, and subtle comparisons that reminded everyone that she considered me fortunate to have entered her family, never the other way around. When I became pregnant with twins, something about Victoria's behavior changed. Suddenly she seemed interested in my well-being. She sent expensive gifts, called to ask about medical appointments, and became far more involved than she had ever been before. At the time I assumed she was simply excited about becoming a grandmother. Now I understand that she was studying an asset she considered valuable. Because for people like Victoria, even family eventually becomes something to acquire, manage, and control. The delivery was difficult and exhausting, but the moment I held my daughters for the first time, everything else seemed to lose importance. During those first few days I barely thought about the tensions in my marriage or Ethan's growing absences. My entire world revolved around my girls, their tiny hands, their quiet breathing, and the realization that I finally had something far more important than any career or bank account, which is exactly why the scene that unfolded in that hospital room felt so absurd, because while I was looking at my newborn daughters, my husband, his mistress, and my mother-in-law were attempting to negotiate as if they were discussing the purchase of a piece of property. Victoria spoke for several minutes, explaining that Ethan had decided to move forward with his life, that the woman standing beside him represented his future, and that the most practical solution was to resolve everything in a civilized manner. She used words like stability, opportunity, and family welfare, carefully selected language designed to disguise the cruelty of what she was proposing. Then she pointed toward the check and informed me that $22 million was an extraordinarily generous amount of money, more than enough to start over anywhere in the world. While she continued speaking, I studied the documents spread across my bed, trying to understand how anyone could genuinely believe a mother would sell her own children, until something caught my attention. It wasn't the check, it wasn't the divorce paperwork, it was the name of a corporate subsidiary printed near the bottom of one page. Most people would never have noticed it, but I had spent years analyzing financial reports, regulatory filings, and corporate risk models. I knew that company, or at least I knew the rumors surrounding it, rumors that had circulated through parts of the industry for years without ever being fully proven. And the moment I saw that name appear in a document where it had absolutely no reason to exist, I felt the same sensation I always experienced when reviewing financial statements and discovering a number that didn't belong, a small inconsistency, an uncomfortable detail, something insignificant enough for everyone else to overlook, yet impossible for me to ignore. While Victoria continued speaking as though she controlled every outcome, while Ethan avoided making eye contact and his mistress stood silently believing she was witnessing the end of my story, I began running calculations in my head, because numbers possess a remarkable quality. They can be hidden for years, rearranged, disguised, and buried beneath mountains of paperwork, but eventually they demand reconciliation with reality. And the longer a debt, a lie, or a risk remains hidden, the more destructive the consequences become when the truth finally surfaces. When the three of them left my hospital room, they were convinced they had presented me with an impossible choice: accept the money or lose everything. But the moment the door closed behind them, I picked up the documents again and stared at the name of that subsidiary for a second time, because something deep inside me was telling me that the real story was not the $22 million check they had left on my bed. The real story was buried inside a much larger number that someone had spent years trying to hide, and if my suspicions were correct, the fortune that had made Victoria Whitmore one of the most powerful women in the country was built on a financial time bomb that was already counting down toward its inevitable explosion. Over the following weeks, no one from the Whitmore family contacted me directly, which might have seemed unusual to an outsider, but in reality it fit perfectly with the way Victoria operated, because people who spend their lives surrounded by power rarely repeat an order when they are convinced they have already won. To her, the $22 million check had been a demonstration of strength, an offer so overwhelming that refusal seemed irrational, and she was so certain of her own superiority that she never considered the possibility that I might be studying the documents instead of signing them. Meanwhile, Ethan limited all communication to attorneys, sending carefully worded messages about divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, and financial settlements that appeared generous on the surface, but carried one clear objective: to create enough distance between me and my daughters for the legal machinery of his family to finish what they had started in that hospital room. I did not respond immediately, not because I was defeated, and certainly not because I was considering their proposal, but because I needed time to recover physically, time to adjust to life with two newborns, and most importantly, time to understand why the name of that subsidiary had appeared inside documents where it had absolutely no reason to exist, because the more I reviewed the folder, the more convinced I became that it was not an administrative mistake. Someone had reused internal templates, someone had copied legal references without paying attention, and in doing so they had accidentally left a small opening into something far more valuable than my divorce case, a glimpse into the hidden structure of Victoria Whitmore's empire. For years I had worked with risk models, actuarial projections, financial disclosures, and regulatory reports, which meant I knew exactly where to look for information hidden in plain sight. Most people imagine that major fortunes keep all their secrets behind locked doors, but the truth is far less dramatic. Large corporations leave thousands of traces scattered across public records, quarterly reports, investor presentations, legal filings, compliance disclosures, and regulatory submissions. Each piece appears insignificant on its own, yet together they can reveal a story completely different from the one executives tell the public. So every time my daughters fell asleep, instead of resting, I sat in front of my computer and began assembling the puzzle one document at a time. At first, the inconsistencies seemed minor, small differences between financial statements filed in different years, unusual reclassifications of assets, internal transfers that lacked any obvious economic purpose, nothing that would independently prove misconduct, but enough to attract the attention of someone trained to recognize hidden exposure. Because healthy businesses rarely move money endlessly between obscure subsidiaries without a compelling reason, and they certainly do not create structures where losses appear in one entity while profits miraculously emerge in another. The deeper I looked, the more apparent it became that someone had spent years building a system designed to conceal the true level of risk sitting beneath the surface. What I discovered next forced me to review the numbers repeatedly just to make sure I wasn't making a mistake, because the scale of it was difficult to believe. One of the most important divisions within Victoria's financial empire had been selling products supported by extraordinarily optimistic actuarial assumptions that only worked if several key variables remained within near-perfect ranges for years at a time, something any experienced professional knew was highly unlikely. In other words, the business appeared profitable because the real risks had been systematically underestimated, and the larger the company grew, the larger the hidden gap became beneath it. Most people in my position might have viewed that discovery as leverage, an opportunity to negotiate a better settlement, to threaten the Whitmore family quietly, or to extract even more money than they had originally offered. But I understood something they did not. When a financial company hides risk, it is not merely deceiving wealthy investors, it is placing thousands of ordinary people in danger: retirees, families, business owners, and clients who depend on those promises remaining valid. Years into the future, which meant the situation had stopped being personal, it had become something much larger. About a month later, I received an unexpected phone call from Victoria herself, our first direct conversation since the hospital. Her tone was polite, almost friendly, but beneath every carefully chosen word I could hear the impatience of someone accustomed to getting immediate results. She asked whether I had reconsidered her offer, reminded me how much money was waiting for me, suggested that prolonging the conflict would only complicate my future, and ended by pointing out that fighting her family would be extraordinarily difficult. I listened without interrupting, allowing her to believe she still controlled the situation, because while she was speaking I already knew something she did not. The real negotiation had ended the moment she walked into that hospital room. After that conversation, I decided to seek a second professional opinion, not because I doubted my calculations, but because I understood the seriousness of what I was uncovering. I contacted a former colleague who worked in regulatory compliance, someone whose reputation for integrity was beyond question. Together we reviewed the available data, reconstructed the financial structure, and tested multiple risk scenarios. By the end of our final meeting, he sat quietly for several seconds while studying one of the spreadsheets before looking directly at me and asking whether I truly understood the magnitude of what we were seeing. Because if the numbers were accurate, we were not looking at a simple accounting irregularity, we were looking at the kind of exposure capable of triggering large-scale regulatory investigations. That night I barely slept, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood why that small discrepancy had captured my attention from the very beginning. The numbers were not wrong by accident, they had been designed to appear correct, and that distinction changed everything, because mistakes can be explained, poor decisions can be corrected, but structures deliberately created to conceal risk point toward something far more dangerous. They point toward intent. Over the following days I gathered every public document I could find, organized timelines, built independent analyses, and prepared a report detailing the inconsistencies and their potential consequences. I avoided emotional language. I did not mention my divorce, Ethan's affair, or the offer they had placed on my hospital bed. I focused entirely on the numbers, because numbers do not feel anger, they do not seek revenge, and they do not care about personal grievances. They simply exist, and When enough of them begin pointing in the same direction, ignoring them becomes impossible. 2 weeks later, I submitted the report, along with supporting documentation, to the appropriate regulatory authorities. Then I closed my laptop, fed my daughters, and continued with my life as though nothing had happened, because by then I understood something fundamental. People like Victoria Whitmore spend their entire lives preparing to fight visible enemies, competitors, journalists, lawsuits, hostile investors, and public scandals, yet they rarely prepare for a regulator asking a simple question while reviewing records that were never supposed to attract attention. What I did not know at the time was that the investigation had already begun moving long before anyone formally contacted the company, nor did I know that several analysts reviewing the same data were reaching conclusions remarkably similar to my own. And while Victoria continued attending charity galas, appearing in financial magazines, and pushing her attorneys to accelerate my divorce, a chain of events had already been set in motion behind the scenes, a chain that would soon place every corner of her empire under scrutiny, every suspicious transfer, every opaque subsidiary, every hidden assumption, and every financial promise that had helped build her reputation, because for the first time in years, someone had forced the numbers to tell the truth, and the truth was preparing to cost Victoria Whitmore far more than $22 million. The first signs that something was changing appeared several months later, not through dramatic headlines or explosive leaks, but through a series of small developments that most people would have overlooked entirely. Executive departures that were quietly announced and quickly forgotten, delayed financial disclosures, cancelled investor meetings, unusual requests for additional documentation, and a growing sense of unease among analysts who had spent years accepting the company's public numbers at face value. Meanwhile, I focused on my daughters, adapting to motherhood, rebuilding my life, and moving through the divorce process one step at a time, because one of the greatest advantages of acting honestly from the beginning is that you never have to waste energy covering your tracks afterward. The regulators were doing their jobs, investigators were asking questions, and the numbers were continuing to tell their own story. Victoria, of course, remained convinced that everything was under control, even when formal requests for information began arriving, even when auditors demanded additional explanations, and even when outside reviewers started questioning assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. She treated each development as a temporary inconvenience, another obstacle her attorneys and consultants would eventually smooth over, because people who spend decades winning often develop the dangerous habit of believing that every problem can be managed if enough money and influence are applied to it. However, financial deception has a weakness that arrogance rarely appreciates. Once multiple independent groups begin examining the same information from different angles, inconsistencies that once seemed invisible suddenly become impossible to ignore. One discrepancy leads to another, one unanswered question creates 3 more, and before long a structure that appeared unshakable begins collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Ethan was the first member of the family to fully understand how serious the situation had become, although by then it was far too late to change the outcome. For most of his life he had enjoyed the security and prestige that came with being Victoria Whitmore's son without ever showing much interest in the mechanisms that generated that wealth. He had simply assumed that the empire was as strong and legitimate as everyone claimed. But when major investors began demanding explanations, when strategic partners started distancing themselves, and when internal financial reviews exposed risks that should have been addressed years earlier, he finally realized that much of the stability he had taken for granted depended on assumptions that could not survive serious scrutiny. I still remember the first time he called me after months of silence. His voice lacked the confidence he had displayed in the hospital. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by exhaustion, anxiety, and a desperate hope that somehow our past relationship could still provide him with a solution. But by that point our story had already ended, and there was nothing left to repair. As the investigation expanded, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Regulators discovered that several divisions within the corporate structure had relied on risk models that consistently understated potential liabilities, creating a misleading picture of financial strength. This did not necessarily mean that every executive had knowingly participated in wrongdoing, But it did reveal a culture where favorable outcomes were rewarded while uncomfortable warnings were ignored. Exactly the kind of environment that allows manageable problems to evolve into catastrophic ones. The deeper investigators looked, the more evidence they found that critical risks had been minimized, delayed, or buried beneath layers of corporate complexity, and with every new discovery the credibility of Victoria's empire weakened further. Financial media eventually picked up the story as corrections were forced into the public record. Articles began discussing hidden exposure, insufficient reserves, flawed projections, and systemic oversight failures, terms that sound dry and technical to most people, but are absolutely devastating to anyone whose reputation depends on projecting complete control. Because money can survive many challenges, markets recover, companies restructure, and assets can be replaced, but trust is far more fragile. And once investors, clients, and partners begin questioning whether your numbers can be believed, rebuilding confidence becomes an uphill battle that few organizations ever fully win. It was around that time that Victoria requested a private meeting, something she never would have considered under normal circumstances. I agreed only because I wanted to hear what she had to say, and when I saw her sitting across from me I immediately noticed the difference. She still wore expensive clothing, she still carried herself with practiced authority, but for the first time there was uncertainty beneath the surface. She spoke about unfair attacks, hostile interests, misunderstandings, and people who wanted to destroy everything she had built, yet she carefully avoided discussing the real source of her problems, because both of us understood that the investigation had not appeared out of nowhere. It had begun the moment someone finally paid attention to the numbers she believed nobody would ever examine closely. Eventually she asked the question she had been building toward from the moment the meeting began. She wanted to know what I wanted, and the fact that she asked it revealed that she still fundamentally misunderstood the situation, because even after everything that had happened she continued to believe that every conflict was ultimately a negotiation, that every person had a price, and that the only challenge was identifying the correct number. She offered settlements, properties, investment accounts, trust funds for my daughters, and sums of money significantly larger than the original $22 million. I listened patiently to every proposal before calmly reminding her of something she should have understood from the beginning. This had never been about money, because the problem was not the size of the check she placed on my hospital bed. The problem was believing that human beings could be valued like assets on a balance sheet. The final consequences unfolded over the following year. Several divisions were forced into restructuring. Major assets were liquidated to cover obligations that had been underestimated for far too long. Partnerships dissolved, investors withdrew, and enormous portions of the family's wealth disappeared while attempting to contain damage that could no longer be hidden. Financial experts described the process using technical language: reserve adjustments, asset impairments, valuation corrections, capital realignments, and restructuring requirements. But behind all those sophisticated terms was a much simpler reality. The fortune Victoria had spent decades building was based on assumptions that could not survive contact with the truth, and reality had finally arrived to collect a debt that had been accumulating for years. The irony was that I never needed to cash the $22 million check. I never threatened anyone, never leaked family secrets, never launched a public campaign against Ethan or his mother. They had created the conditions for their downfall long before I entered the equation. All I did was recognize the risk when I saw it and allow the institutions responsible for addressing it to do their work, because truth possesses a remarkable quality. It can remain buried for years, hidden beneath paperwork, influence, and carefully crafted narratives. But once it finds a path to the surface, it becomes almost impossible to force it underground again. Today my daughters live peaceful lives surrounded by stability, honesty, and people who value them for who they are rather than what they represent. They know the story only as a lesson about dignity, boundaries, and self-respect, not as a story about revenge, because revenge was never the goal. My goal was to protect them, to ensure they grew up understanding that their worth could never be measured by a number written on a piece of paper. And whenever I think back to that afternoon in their hospital, I remember the confidence with which Victoria slid that check across my bed, convinced she was solving a problem with money, completely unaware that she had just handed an actuary the first clue that would expose a far larger lie than she ever imagined. In the end, I recovered exactly what mattered most, not a fortune, not a public victory, and not the satisfaction of watching someone suffer, but my peace, my freedom, and the security of my daughters, while Victoria lost the one asset she could never purchase again, the trust that had supported her entire empire, because fortunes can be built, lost, and rebuilt, markets rise and fall, companies come and go, but when a person spends so much of their life believing everything has a price, sooner or later they discover that some things should never have been assigned a value in the first place.